Good evening, warriors and wastoids, and welcome to the Book of Very, Very Bad Things podcast. I'm your host, Peter. Tonight, I am very excited to show to you all the inner workings of the group known as Gown. Resting comfortably between proto-industrial, dark ambient, power electronics, and soundtrack music. These two young men have created something akin to what we would expect from anyone from Throbbing Gristle to Shinjuku Thief to Lustborn to White House. Something completely its own. Something leering just above your left shoulder, poised to strike. This is eerie, creepy, gorgeous music, rendered by two very young and very affable men. I don't want to go on too long extolling their virtues, but needless to say, I am very impressed with their album Ape of God, and I think everyone should be as impressed with them as I am. So without further ado, I give to you Gown on the Book of Very, Very Bad Things podcast. All right, we're in. Let's see, where do we start? You guys familiar at all with my format? You ever watched the show or listened to it?
Yeah, I've been watching the show for a while now, so
okay.
I'm pretty familiar with it.
All right, so you know what my first question is probably going to be then?
No, lay it on me.
All right. I ask everybody this. What is it existentially you're most terrified of?
Not fulfilling my artistic goals, probably. Living kind of a basic life, I guess.
Yeah.
No, I think I can agree with that. I think both of us are kind of perfectionists when it comes to our art, so it can be hard to be fulfilling with the things we do, but I think it also, at the end of the day, leads to a better product with our art and music.
So what were you trying to accomplish with Ape of God?
So that album was kind of a personal album for me. It was a meditation on where I was spiritually at the time. These past 2 years, we've been going through a lot of stuff in our personal lives, and we were kind of trying to make that into an external artifact, I guess. We wanted to make something that was like very specific to us, I guess, just to externalize those emotions, I guess.
And what was did you have any like how do I put this, like external musical influences that kind of pushed you in the direction you'd gone in? Because it's both soundtrack oriented almost and ambient in a way.
For sure. I'd say our biggest influences, we kind of have an eclectic group of influences that I feel a lot of them actually don't come across on the record. Lou Reed was a huge influence on that record, actually, especially some of the early Velvet Underground stuff, Suicide, some of the early proto-industrial, Throbbing Gristle, Cabaret Voltaire. That stuff was a huge influence on us. Also soundtracks, or really not even soundtracks, but the sonic elements of some older movies. Eraserhead was a big influence. The Apartment trilogy of the Polanski movies was a huge influence sonically. Trying to create an atmosphere kind of like Repulsion or Rosemary's Baby. Those were huge influences on where we wanted to go with the sound of that album.
A lot of paranoia, in other words.
Yes, for sure. Discomfort. We were really thinking a lot about cults. I feel like that was a massive influence on us. We were doing a lot of research into doomsday cults, Branch Davidians, and the Manson family. a lot of that, I think, comes across on the record. Feeling like you're not in full control of where you're going. Like you're kind of being propelled in a direction subconsciously by forces outside of yourself.
And the vocals that are included on the album are very, like, they're almost indiscernible. And, you know, it sounds like it is used more as an instrument. And it invokes like a almost ritualistic chant style.
Yeah, that's something we did very intentionally. We were thinking about a lot of our favorite music. The vocals are very buried. My Bloody Valentine was a huge inspiration on us. The Jesus and Mary chain. I really get a lot from bands where the lyrics have a level of vague, undiscernible, kind of subconscious impact. I feel like it leaves a lot more to your imagination, at least for me. That's something we'll have a very broad theme that we kind of want to explore, and we'll write down some words in kind of a cut-up style, and then experiment with different vocal processes and stuff to kind of invoke that almost like schizophrenic type of atmosphere that we're going for.
So almost like a William S. Burroughs style of collage lyric.
Yes, for sure.
I was wondering where you got the title from, Ape of God, because I know I listened to another band that also had albums called Ape of God, but I'm guessing you had no idea about that because
no.
Yeah, they're more like in the like post-metal, like sludge genre. So I mean, obviously, like I don't even know where they got it from. I was wondering what that title meant to you specifically.
Well, we were actually reading at the time a lot of early Aleister Crowley stuff and Book of Revelations. Those were both major influences, and that actually comes from one of the interpretations of the Book of Revelations. And we just thought it would make a really good kind of statement towards what the record was really about. I mean, we had a lot of themes of, I guess, Western, esoteric, occult stuff in that album. I think that was really why we chose that name. It kind of was an all-encompassing title towards what we were going for.
Yeah, like the Thelema type elements.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I've grew up being incredibly invested in the works of Crowley, so I've since, you know, learned to look at it more as like a. I don't want to call it a phase because it still sort of has an impact on the way I think about spirituality, but not so much as something that I would fully dedicate myself to. I tend to separate the wheat from the chaff with spirituality at this stage in the game. I'm 45. I can't really, you know, but at that time throughout my teens and early 20s, Crowley was a focal point for me. He's brilliant. A brilliant psychopath.
Yeah, that's kind of where we're at now. We're both in our early 20s, and I think we don't really subscribe to any specific ideology or dogma. I think any real hyper-structured thinking is kind of antithetical towards our goals artistically. We'll kind of latch on to ideas. Especially whenever I was a bit younger, you know, started with like LaVey and all that stuff. And then,
I was a member of the Church of Satan.
Yeah, I think that stuff has definitely had a major influence on us in terms of just themes we choose to explore in our music. But where we stand personally, I feel like our understanding of spirituality is much more abstract than a lot of those ideologies tend to have. But they are fun to think about, and they bring up a lot of themes that are very fun to explore, very liberating artistically.
Yeah, especially since you can kind of like remove yourself from the equation sort of and explore the theme instead of just like strictly making internalized dialogues,
For sure.
You could sort of lose yourself in someone else's mania for a brief time, and that can be very liberating.
We found, I think a major part of our goals in our music is really to create a atmosphere, a trance. I think when we started creating music years ago, we've been writing for probably since we were like early teenagers and just never released anything. Just experimenting with much more structured songs and stuff. And over our years of kind of experimenting, I think we found a way to create or induce a sort of trance-like state with our music. And that's kind of been our goal, especially with Ape of God and this project specifically. Eventually, we plan on branching out and creating some side projects that have different goals. But with Gown, our goal has kind of been to create a transcendental state, less so song focused and more of just a meditation on a certain vibe.
Yeah, it definitely imbues that mindset. I listened to it I listened to it for about an hour today. I all the way through once, and then it started over again, and then I had to get on my first interview. But it definitely does have I want to say almost like Dario Argento-esque, like Giallo feel to it, where, it feels like I'm in a 70s horror film when I listen to it.
That's awesome to hear. That was one of our main goals, was watching some of these movies like Don't Look Now, or, a lot of that stuff was a very big influence on that record. It's just very nice to hear that. I'm glad it accomplishes that. It's a strange thing trying to conceptualize something whenever you worked on it for so long. I mean, we worked on that record for 3 years, and it was a long haul because we're not the most prolific, but we really put a lot of layers into that music. And I think another large goal for us, like a lot of those old psychological horror movies, is I get more out of them the more I watch them. I might not pick up on all the elements of it the first time I watch it, but the 10th time I watch it, I'm still picking up on new things, new details. And I think we both really consciously put very subtle things into the music, almost subliminal. We were always influenced by the whole satanic panic stuff, and I feel like that was another big vibe.
That was my era. That's when I grew up. That was actually a massive focal point of my youth. There were times when I was young when we weren't allowed to go out to recess in elementary school because the level of paranoia over children being kidnapped and all this hokum that had transpired, like it was palpable. People actually fully believed there were these roving bands of satanic cults, which there was one in my area that did do some things, but nothing to the point of like kidnapping children and ritualistically slaughtering them.
Yeah,
come on.
That atmosphere definitely has permeated our area. We're from Louisville, Kentucky.
Oh, okay.
So we are just surrounded by, the Shandashera case that was right by us with the Witch's Castle.
Yep.
We have the Devil's Mountain in Milltown, Indiana, which isn't too far away, which is just another famous spot for this kind of panic. And we actually have a music video coming out probably in the next couple months where we shot on location at a couple of those places. Just because I feel like they were very conscious inspiration when we first started conceptualizing the record. It was like the stains of that paranoia are still very, very well felt, at least here in the Midwest. Just also with the way the world is kind of just becoming more polarized, and us growing up in a polarized world too. It's like that's all we've really ever known.
I can't. I have a daughter that's very close to your age, and I always felt terrible about that because there's, at least my parents' generation, my dad was in Vietnam, but my parents were both hippies. I grew up in a very, liberal thinking sort of home where, we were allowed to express ourselves and be musicians and read poetry. And that was the norm. My daughter's generation, it seems like a lot of her contemporaries grew up in a very, like you said, polarized atmosphere. And it's antithetical to what progress should be, but
exactly. It's so funny because especially with us, it's almost like we've kind of dealt with seeing our generation go through this like self-imposed artistic and just, it's like castration on even just thought. Like, I don't know. And I think that's something that we have actively tried to avoid. We are pretty, we isolate a bit in terms of our social media usage and things personally, because I feel like it's just damaging on a creative level and on a personal level to be exposed to the level of negativity and chaos in the media that's just constant.
And it gave the rise to things like trolling. Which I get my fair share of, but I just don't understand how anyone could have the time to log on to a musician's or a journalist or anyone's social media just to fuck with them. It doesn't, like, I don't have that kind of time, and I wouldn't enjoy doing that. It just doesn't seem fun. But there is a legitimate movement of human beings that's what they do to get their rocks off, and it's pathetic.
Yeah, and that's something that with society as a greater whole that we definitely have kept a careful eye on, is just this strange unconscious move towards negativity, putting each other down and like really basking in it. It's kind of disturbing, and I that's a big reason that we create, is to get to reflect on that stuff, because it's actually, it creates a lot of paranoia in our personal lives, because it's like, where is this gonna go? What's the end point 30 years from now? How, like, it just doesn't seem like things are moving it in a positive direction. It's like one step forward and two steps back. And so that's definitely something that we've spent a lot of time thinking about, and kind of feeds into the paranoia that we both kind of experienced to a degree. And I'm sure you can relate to that. But
I can in a vastly dissimilar way, because I started high school in the late 1980s. So my my adolescence was kind of rife more with the physical side of bullying and whatnot. And had I not been an athlete while being a punk rocker, I probably would have gotten my ass kicked on an almost daily basis. But I played baseball, so I almost got a pass for being like the cool freak to the jocks and whatnot. But there was still like, you know, I would take my adolescence over yours any day, because a couple fist fights here or there for having a mohawk in the 80s, I'll deal with that. You know what I mean? Like this, it's a constant barrage, and you're juxtaposed on all sides.
Oh, it's overstimulation.
Yeah.
I think we were both lucky. We're both we've always been into fitness and stuff, so we weren't really picked on. We had friends that were, and I think that there was just an air of paranoia throughout our teenage years. Part of that probably because we were like constantly smoking pot, but part of it was just really constantly feeling watched. I mean, when you're displaying your entire life on social media and it's kind of expected for everybody, it's like a contest. You're constantly trying to, everyone has an audience, everyone's a micro celebrity, and that creates a weird self-doubt and insecurity. And I think everybody in our generation, it's like,
well, yeah, because you have to keep up some sort of appearance,
image.
Time. See, the one thing that the one reason I do really relate to that is I've been playing in hardcore and punk bands since 1988, 89. And, you know, I did kind of have some kind of image to uphold, but thankfully that image was the whole, like, fuck you of it all. Like the running counter to societal mores, you know? Like,
yeah.
So I didn't really, the only thing I had to live up to was constantly being, you know, the being arch.
That's something we struggled with too, coming up as we started working on art and things. We kept kind of going in this almost disingenuous direction of trying to fit a certain image we were trying to create. And after a while, I think we realized, for us, integrity's always been the most important thing in art. We're big Black fans, and a lot of Steve Albini stuff, and like it's very liberating to see a guy who is like a giant nerd like him just create such just dark and disturbing art. But it has teeth. It's and I feel like that's important to us, is to, our art is a reflection of a part of who we are as people, but it's not an all-encompassing reality, I guess. We, like this band, Gown specifically, like that's a very specific corner of our personality. But it's not us totally. It's just a part of us. And so we're less concerned about upholding a certain image and more concerned about just being authentic, I think.
Have you considered sort of taking this into a live setting?
Oh yeah, we've thought a lot about it. We're actually working on an EP. We have a couple of members who do not write with us, but they're going to help us perform this stuff live. I don't know if you're familiar with Coil, but we're taking a lot of inspiration from their playbook, and that's kind of a direction that we find really invigorating. And we really kind of actively avoid looking at some of our contemporaries, because I think there's just kind of a homogeny with experimental music right now. And I love a lot of contemporary experimental artists, but we're really interested in going in a different direction with it, I think. And
my last interview that I'd just done right before I got on with you, I launched into a dissertation extolling the virtues of Chris and Cozy from Coil.
Oh, you love them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I talked about how back in the late 80s, I searched for literally 4 years trying to find a hard copy, like vinyl version of Coil's themes for Hellraiser, the unused themes
Oh yeah.
from the original Hellraiser soundtrack that never got used. And when I finally did, it was like I felt as though, I had found something akin to the Grail.
Yeah, and that actually, it's funny you bring that up specifically. That was less sonically, more thematically, a big inspiration for this band. Not even just the album, but a lot of Chris and Cozy were a huge influence. Clive Barker's stuff in general, like Hellraiser, Books of Blood, all of that's been a very big influence on us too. And man, we a lot of Cozy's solo stuff too has been a big influence on us.
Man was utter genius.
Yeah, and beautiful stuff. We're actually creating an EP now that's will probably be out by fall of this year, and it's going to be more abrasive for sure. I'd say it's definitely leaning in a more traditionally industrial direction, probably closer to something like early Swans or like some early Throbbing Gristle stuff. We've been really inspired by like Event Horizon and Hellraiser and these movies with this sadomasochistic techno occult thing. It's like a very specific vibe, but that's kind of the direction we're going in with the EP.
I dig that vibe. That is right up my alley. Clive Barker is the reason why I became a writer, and that whole era, and having gotten to witness it as it happened was brilliant. But when like Skinny Puppy first started to really hit, and Swans were still going. I mean, they still are, but like Swans were, you could go see them. There was that whole movement of like, they were almost like Swans were almost mainstream at one point. Jesus Lizard were mainstream. Slint were almost mainstream. There was a time, and they're from your area.
Yeah.
That time period had that odd vibe where like piercing magazines were like an underground thing, and like they were in with, you'd had to go to porn shops to buy piercing magazines, and it was a very S&M based, less accessory based lifestyle. And that whole pastiche of industrial music and S&M and piercings, and it was very attractive to me in that time period, and I still long for that.
It's a very captivating aesthetic. It's been something I've always kind of gravitated towards, even when I really was a kid, watching like old kind of schlocky torture porn horror movies. Because we grew up right when like Saw and Hostel and all that shit was like huge.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of branded itself on our subconscious, and that's just maybe a little traumatizing, but we really draw a lot of inspiration from that stuff.
See, what that stuff was to you is what Cannibal Holocaust was to me.
Oh,
like that was when I was a kid. You found
Faces of
Death, Cannibal Holocaust, Cannibal Ferox. Like, I think every generation has those touchstones, and I can't shit on Hostel, and I definitely can't shit on the first Saw, because that was a fantastic movie. But there's that same set of a few things with the music and the film and the literature that just kind of set the same ball rolling every generation or two. That creates amazing art.
Oh, yeah, and it's great, because as much as I can kind of shit on some of the schlocky torture porn stuff of, Human Centipede and all that stuff. If it wasn't for those kind of mainstream interpretations of that style, we wouldn't have discovered a lot of these like indie, smaller B horror movies. Like we were actually, when we were teenagers, we were kind of obsessed with. We'd just take like mushrooms and watch stuff like the guinea pig movies. I don't know if you've ever heard. We'd watch Flowers of Flesh and Blood. Yeah. We'd take mushrooms and watch that. And that was a hellish experience, but it's something that I think has really inspired a lot of what we try to do. We kind of want to be the sonic equivalent to that vibe, I guess. With this album specifically, it was probably closer to something like early Roman Polanski, but with the EP that we're working on currently, it's definitely going more into that BDSM, early internet, underground scene. We've done a lot of digging in that direction, and I feel like that's kind of where we're at now.
Did you find Dan's Gallery of the Grotesque from the 90s by any chance?
We've gone through a lot of archives from like Ogrish and all that stuff, and kind of regret it, but at the same time, it's.
There was one called Defecation Vacation. Oh my God, there was just such fucked up stuff out there, and like the deep web is kind of where you go for that stuff now. And it's scary. That's a scary place because you could wander into some stuff that you can't.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like we grew up in that Goldilocks period where that stuff was really subversive. I mean, and you could find it on the clear web. You wouldn't even look for it, and you'd stumble upon these sites that were just fucked.
Yeah.
And I think that stuff really inspired us in a way, being like on early AOL and just on these like gaming forums, and then you click a link and it brings you to like some horrific, body mod site, like BME Pain Olympics and that kind of stuff. And there's something about that aesthetic, the aesthetic of that early like proto internet, that I just feel like it's so subversive and captivating compared to now. Now everybody's so desensitized that I feel like, you get on Reddit and it's like r/watch people die and all this stuff, and it's just in your face.
Yeah.
And I think
this
in its own right's inspiring, but
this is the generation that gave us, what is it? A Serbian film. Like, holy fuck.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a rough one.
That's one of those movies where like, and I'm a horror film buff. That is what I watch. I'm a horror writer. That movie. Fuck no.
It's horrible.
I watched it once. I'm a father. I can't watch that again.
Yeah. And see, that's something we kind of find forced, contrived edginess to be a little bit like passe and repulsive. As much as I enjoy the aesthetic of and kind of the psychology of this kind of fucked up media, I'm not a big fan of edge for the sake of it. Yeah. I find it.
And as the statement that he supposedly intended it to be, which was like, being a Serbian, you're fucked from birth, because the Serbian government they are terrible. But to show that the infant born and then what happened, like it was like, okay, yeah, you're just trying to shock You're trying to be the most shocking thing, so you get talked about, and he succeeded.
Yeah, and that's I feel like there's a fine line, and we try to really stay on that line. When we were coming up, we had a phase where we were really into like power electronics and
I used to make power electronics music,
and a lot of it's really interesting, and
a lot of it just really just bullshit.
We would find these artists, and it was just such a strange fixation on like pedophilia and stuff, like Peter Sotos.
Mm-hmm.
And it almost seemed like, I don't know, when I listen to it now, there's just a level, there's being provocative in earnest. Yeah. And then there's just like the dick measuring contest of like who can be the edgiest. And I feel like that's something that we actively try to avoid, but at the same time, it's inspiring in a way that there are people who, really the psychology of why they want to push so far in that direction is what is interesting to me, more so than the music itself.
Well, I mean, and in fairness, you have people like Masayami Akita, Mare's Bow.
Oh, yeah.
Like that's art.
Oh, yeah. And
that's art. But then you have like, as much as, you know, I think some noise artists are absolutely incredible. Some of it, like, it's just like the whole Nazi bent. A lot of them seem to push. It turns me off, and it's the same thing with the pedophilia stuff and the sexual violence. It just doesn't. It doesn't ring true. It doesn't. It's not provocative in a sense that, you know, incites conversation or, you know, elicits a response of true revulsion. It elicits a response of like, just give me a fucking break.
It's very contrived. And that's kind of something that we picked up on as well. It's like the inauthenticity of that stuff. We're big fans of like Brighter Death Now.
I love Brighter Death Now.
Some of the early White House stuff. And then you just, especially with like White House, the direction they kind of went in to become just more and more, I guess, provocative for the sake of it. It just kind of rings as inauthentic to us, and
that's the direction Condom took. And you know, then you know, there's also like I don't know if you're familiar with N Nile. N Nile, that is it's noise, but it's also a lot like Shinjuku Thief. It has orchestral moments and dark ambient moments.
Oh, that sounds very interesting.
It's very, very unique and very well done. I guess for every 50 or 60 of those artists, there's one good one.
Yeah, but then you find a good one and they're great. And that's like we kind of, at least in creating, kind of try to stay away from, and it not even intentionally, fitting cleanly into a genre. But God, when you find a good genre artist that just encapsulates that sound, I mean, it's like when we first were starting to listen to dark ambient, and then you find like Lust Mord, who's just like the king of that.
I just and there you just them on the last episode too.
Yeah, and you listen to that, and I remember the first time I listened to that, I was in a cemetery, and it was just like the perfect atmosphere for that music. And while it was very much a genre thing, it was so well done and groundbreaking that I don't know. It's just mind-blowing when somebody can do a genre in such a captivating way.
That's how I always felt about Shinjuku Thief too. And like, it just so happens that both Shinjuku Thief and Lust Mord are doing movie soundtracks now. Makes sense. If you're making something that's that powerful and that unique, it's going to lend itself to something cinematic. That's what I think you guys are doing. I can completely see. I could completely see what you do, put over a really, really well done, like genre horror film.
That's always kind of been a motivator for us too, is just almost like we're scoring movies that don't exist, I think, to a degree. And a lot of that too is we've gotten so much inspiration from like this new wave of like cerebral horror, like, you know, the Ari Aster stuff and all the A24 stuff coming out. It's very liberating because now we have stuff to actually look forward to instead of just digging into the past. Because I mean, for a good 5 years, we were just obsessed with finding like the most fringe horror bootlegs, and just digging for that. And then it's exciting because it's like a revival of the old psychological horror that like Polanski was doing.
Yeah.
And I kind of thought that was dead. We grew up with a lot of just shitty paranormal movies and stuff that, I mean, they're kind of fun to watch if you like get drunk or whatever, but I just, they don't give you much to think about.
They're not The Shining. Now, you want to talk about a good paranormal horror film, The Shining is prime example, but look at the director.
Yeah. And that's another great one. That's another favorite. Shining, 2001, also very inspirational on us. Anything that really can capture and invoke a very specific environment is really what I think I get the most out of artistically. I can't speak for Dylan, but I know for me at least, it's like the art that I find most intriguing and captivating is something that is very unique and I can't get anywhere else. Maybe it has similarities to some other bands, or movies. But when I watch a movie like Rosemary's Baby, it's just so, I can't get that itch scratched anywhere else. Maybe Hereditary a little bit, but I mean, it's so oppressive and cerebral, and it's just perfect to me. And there's bands like that too. It's like a record I think of right off the top of my head is like Lungs, Big Black's first record.
Yeah.
Criminally underrated, but that album specifically is just one of those where that's just an itch I cannot scratch anywhere else. I can find bands that are kind of comparable, but I always find myself going back to that. And that's kind of what we're interested in, especially artistically, just creating something that's original, or tries to be.
That's been a recurring theme with all of my favorites as well. I mean, you know, Big Black being one of them, Slint being one of them, Neurosis being one of them. Like those bands, they're doing something wholly unique and unto themselves. And it just so happens that Albini produced all of the above and was in one.
Yeah, that would be a dream for us, would be to work with Albini. He's adore his stuff.
He's cheap.
Yeah. We don't have much experience working with tape. We work with Ableton primarily. So, but I think it'd be a very interesting experience for sure. Most of my favorite records in some way, shape, or form tie back into Albini. Even if he wasn't directly working on it, it's something that like ended up influencing his work, or you know, there's some connection, there's some thread to it. So
you ever dig into like Rape Man?
Yeah, good stuff.
He got into such shit for naming the group that, and people didn't understand that was a manga comic book. It wasn't his stance on anything. That was just the name of the comic book.
he likes to start some shit too. He really gets off on being provocative, and that's something I really do enjoy about him, is he's such a showman about, you know.
He's like Boyd Rice. They're one and the same. The both of them are just very like they say things that are so counter to what, you know, the current zeitgeist is. It's fascinating to watch them, you know, light their own careers on fire, yet not suffer for it in one instance.
No, not at all. I think if it wasn't for Albini too, that wouldn't have led me to find like Cabaret Voltaire or Suicide. And those bands have been just huge for us. Gosh, just so much good music attached to him, and all that stuff in Chicago. When we were younger, we were really into like the Wax Trax stuff, and early Ministry. Well, not super early Ministry, like 90s Ministry.
But like post disco.
Yeah, and Skinny Puppy and Pig and Pig Face, like those bands were.
Pig and Pig Face are both good.
Yeah, we were really into that stuff, especially when we were younger. I mean, I'm not afraid to admit that I'm like a pretty big Nine Inch Nails fan.
Dude,
and I
was pen pals with Trent Reznor back in the early 90s before, Downward Spiral, because there was a movie in 88, 89 called Class of 1999. It was the first time Nine Inch Nails was ever heard by anyone on the soundtrack to that. And it was Head Like a Hole. It was before Pretty Hate Machine came out. And I wanted to know who that was immediately. It was a shitty movie, but it was a great song. And a couple months later, the Head Like a Hole video hits MTV. I went out, I bought Pretty Hate Machine, and his P.O. box was right inside of it. And I started writing, like, I was a young kid. I was 13. I started writing him fan letters. And he'd write you back.
That's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, that in my era, that existed, though.
Yeah. Now it's impossible. I mean, really. I've had the pleasure. I know you had Lycia on, and that's actually how I found your stuff.
They're very old friends of mine.
Yeah, they were a huge inspiration on, at least me personally. My dad was a fan of theirs, and then I kind of grew up listening to them. And then, I've had the pleasure of having a little bit of communication with Tara and everything, and she's great.
She's one of my best friends, legitimately one of my best friends.
And it's just, I've been fortunate, and I know Dylan and I both have had experiences with like meeting some of our idols and stuff, and we've been fortunate that pretty much everyone we've met has been great. Mm-hmm. But I am wary, and I'm thankful to a degree that I haven't met some people that I kind of hold to this like godlike esteem, and because I don't know, I always kind of default to, wow, they're probably going to be an asshole, but it's
thought
surprising.
I thought like Pete Steele from Typo Negative was going to be like that, but he moved to my area about 6 or 7 years before he died, and I would run into him in bars and stuff, and we ended up like striking up an acquaintance.
That's been just super nice, and that's kind of something I'm hoping, like, if we ever take off, I don't see the point in becoming some giant asshole to uphold an image, because there are people like that. I've met a couple people, and a lot of it's like small local bands, and they feel the need to just exude arrogance and shittiness. I'm like, I like people who are down to earth. I think you don't have to be a giant dick to be a captivating artist.
Not at all. As a matter of fact, that runs completely counter to being a captivating artist. To have that workman-like blue-collar attitude towards the creation and execution of art, that to me, that makes a person all the more interesting and more magnetic. Because I don't look up to people who are in their little ivory tower, away from everyone, just whittling away at their perfect works of art, and they're too above anyone else to interact. I mean, conversely, some of the people that I've met were very famous and just wanted to be left the fuck alone, and they were still cool. But I can also see if you have people constantly trying to get a second of your time, how you could kind of become a little annoyed by that.
Oh, for sure. I think it's definitely within limits. I'd say I can't imagine being somebody who's so famous and renowned that they just cannot have a moment of privacy. My problem, I think, really falls with people who are in no position to be as arrogant as they are, but they feel the need to embody like this. It's a joke. They want to have this rock star persona that's so contrived and repugnant, and I don't know. I kind of have a lot of disdain for that.
Yeah.
Because I've met contemporaries to us that have that kind of smug inauthenticity, and to me a lot of it screams like insecurity.
That's what it is.
You're really trying to like project this image instead of just making authentic art, and being vulnerable and putting a part of yourself that, hey, it might be an ugly part of yourself. It might be a part of yourself that you don't even feel comfortable channeling into art, but it just happens. And that's the art that I find so captivating, is whenever people are really just laying themselves bare.
I think that's why, in my time period, why people like Trent Reznor or people like Kurt Cobain, even, like, there wasn't really a guise going on there. There was a lack of guile. It was just people making something that, truly made them feel connected.
Yeah.
And no matter where you stand on Nirvana or Nine Inch Nails or anything, I mean, you can't really question the authenticity of the music, because these weren't people who were out there in that time period teasing their hair and putting on eye makeup and preening around in spandex, which was what they did back then.
Yeah. Exactly. It's like, I think art, especially mainstream art, it's kind of cyclical in nature. Like, in the 60s, there was that giant wave of, experimental, groundbreaking, that push. And then, that kind of slowly died in the 70s, and then became hair music and all that in the 80s. And then in the 90s, there's the big boom. And now I think we're kind of in a state of paralysis, at least in the mainstream. We are pretty big hip-hop fans, especially some of the older hip-hop, like NWA, and we're Big E Smalls is probably my favorite hip-hop artist. And that stuff had such a raw authenticity that now a lot of art is just like pageantry, or a lot of hip hop specifically. And that's something we have some contemporaries, especially locally. There's a lot of artists who are they just lay themselves bare. And I wish there was more of that in hip hop and in mainstream music in general. And I don't mean to sound like pretentious in any way.
Right.
It's just, I feel like authenticity in art is really what separates art from just like vapid entertainment. And that's hard because it's more difficult to lay yourself bare than it is to like make some contrived people pleasing image that, will sell a bunch of clothes. And I don't know, that in some ways the internet helps that, and then in other ways I feel like it just perpetuates a more devalued art.
Well, if I could give you sort of maybe a different perspective, and what I think is probably good news for you both, is the fact that 25, 30 years ago, even farther back, there was a massive amount of gatekeeping within genre. Like, I couldn't necessarily walk around playing the shows my old bands used to play wearing a Lycia t-shirt because, that's not hardcore. That's not hard. That's not hardcore. What are you doing at a Gorilla Biscuit show with a Lycia t-shirt on? Or what are you doing at a Lycia show wearing a Sick of It All long sleeve? Or, and on it goes. Same thing with every genre. I think even though there probably still is a good amount of gatekeeping, I don't think it's as bad.
Oh no.
And I think your generation specifically has successfully melded genre in a way my generation never could have.
That is something that I will say is very liberating for us as artists, just that there is no constraints at all. And I mean, if you're interested in doing something that's, more appealing to a mainstream audience, I can see putting constraints on yourself. But really, equipment's a lot cheaper now. You can get good audio equipment for like relatively cheap. You don't need a label. Mm-hmm. We're fortunate enough that we've made some like good connections and things, but you can do that stuff yourself now. You really don't. You don't have to move to LA. And you don't have to move to New York. You can be in the middle of nowhere and make your art however you want to. And that's very liberating. And I think there is kind of like, especially when we were a little bit younger, we did kind of romanticize that like cassette swapping.
I was a part of that.
4-track digitact, like her just making these, I don't know, lo-fi Daniel Johnston like things and passing them out to people. And that some of that mystique and just I don't know, the aesthetic of that, and there's something very romantic about it. But then logically, I'm very grateful that we have this amazing tool of the internet to be able to just to guide our music towards a audience. We have a lot of control over our own marketing in a way that I don't think a lot of bands did, especially experimental bands, really before the 2000s, because you'd have to carve yourself into a scene. And if you're somebody who doesn't fit, within that scene, you couldn't really, unless you just got incredibly lucky, carve out a whole new scene.
Yeah, that's what the big problem like Lycia had was, Mike didn't have, jet black hair and mope around and look like he belonged with the goth scene that he got lumped into, even though they weren't a goth band. That Mike had long hair and wore flannels and kind of looked like, the way he described it, like a Leonard Skinner fan.
And that's something like I love that though, because it's authentic. And as much as I love theatrics, and I know once we start playing live, there will be a theatrical element to what we do. But that's less inauthenticity and us more wanting to embody the aesthetic of whatever project we're doing at a certain time. Because like we might, if we play a show with this band, it's going to be one type of show. And then, once we eventually launch a couple of these other projects that we're working on, those will be a very different aesthetic. Mm-hmm. So we can kind of go back and forth and play with it. We don't have to constrain ourselves to one static thing. It's much more liberating to be able to play around with that and not have to worry so much about fitting some like arbitrary scene identity. I can see with like the goth scene and stuff how, God, there's still a lot of gatekeeping with that. There's some goth clubs around here that we've gone to a couple times, and it's just, there's a bit of toxicity in that. But there's also camaraderie in a scene, so I'm kind of conflicted on it. But
It all depends legitimately on what the overall like vibe is with that specific scene. I mean, when I first got involved in the hardcore scene back in the 80s, it was a very warm, welcoming, like, oh my God, I see you in high school. You like this too? Like, if you saw another dude with the Misfits or Minor Threat t-shirt, you were all like walking up and saying hi to them, like in public, like not even knowing them, just, oh, you're one of mine. You're of my tribe. There was even that wearing a Cure t-shirt in school. Like, oh, you too. Oh, hey, like there was an instant familiarity that was imbued in that probably doesn't happen now.
Well, there is some of it, I will say, because especially with this kind of new wave of like contemporary experimental music, a lot of it being like the experimental hip hop scene, like Death Grips and some
Dialect. You listen
Dialect.
to Dialect?
I love Dialect. Yeah, that's actually, gosh, the name of the record's escaping me, but I think it was like 2005. But they had a really great record that, they're great. But those bands, I've noticed that stuff's kind of developing a scene. Even around here, I've seen a lot of people with like these very obscure experimental rap artists shirts and things, and that's still kind of there, but there's also like some weird gatekeeping to it also. I don't know, like, oh, you like this band? Well, do you like their, demo tape from 6 years ago that was only released on, some file torrent website? That stuff is where I get kind of lost. The scenes kind of lose me there, but I also just love the camaraderie of it. I think it's kind of beautiful whenever you have a bunch of people who just love a band get together or a type of music. Just sucks whenever it becomes a pissing contest, but that's just kind of inevitable.
That's what I was going to say. There's always going to be that select few that just think it's, like a big dick contest, and there's legitimately no need if you're all there, unified under the spirit of just enjoying one thing.
One of the worst scenes or communities I've found for that stuff is like the IDM scene, like Aphex Twin and all of that stuff. It's like, oh my God, some of these people have huge egos, like fucking monolithic.
Yeah.
And I love a lot of that music, but I cannot do the community with that kind of stuff. It's just too toxic. And that's something I always just personally will be against, is gatekeeping or pretending that, just because I like something that's super obscure, that means I'm somehow better than you.
Yeah.
I find that kind of hipster mentality to be really frustrating, especially when you legitimately love experimental art, because then you kind of hesitate to tell people about it because they'll think you're being one of these like pretentious, smug, posers, to say it.
Because like, you don't have the very first Einstores and Newbotten demo. Like, come on, like,
it's really weird. It's just it's like a microcosm too, because you'll literally get into like proto-industrial stuff, which is like one of probably the most abrasive like subgenres of industrial, and then you'll get into that and they'll be like, oh, you only like 20 jazz funk greats, you don't like this like obscure SPK album, or Cabaret Voltaire demo. It's just, that stuff really bothers me, and I do think it's kind of going away with the internet and with the ability to find more niche subgenres and artists that are really just pushing boundaries beyond what anybody could imagine. I think it's kind of starting to get a little bit better, but hopefully it continues towards that trajectory of being a little bit more accepting and just positive. I think art's really meant to be loved and shared and not held as like some weapon of
like it's a secret.
Exactly. Like people make it part of their identity, and they feel like if anybody else enjoys what they enjoy, they lose interest in it. That's why I've seen, you see stuff like whenever Nine Inch Nails got big, their fans kind of turn on them, those original fans, a lot of them, because it's like, oh, you're selling out. I'm kind of glad that culture's died, or at least it's dying. I've not noticed much of that. As soon as you get successful, now you're a shill. Like,
well, that's the whole like shtick of that, like, oh well, you're not industrial anymore because Downward Spiral hit the fucking top 10 or something like that. It's not like he changed. He got darker. He got darker and heavier.
Yeah, that album's it's such a miracle of nature that managed to get on the top 10. I listened to that album today and I'm like there is a definite pop sensibility to it, but it is very abrasive.
It's not as poppy as the first album. Pretty Hate Machine was very pop oriented.
Oh yeah,
very pop oriented.
Pop.
It was totally synth pop. It wasn't like Best Wishes era Ministry synth pop, but it had that that new wave vibe to it.
Like you could just tell too on a lot of those songs on like Downward Spiral where he just ran that shit through like preamps and compressors and made it just horrifically abrasive. And it's like you can't, just because something's popular or successful doesn't take away any credibility in my eyes. I mean, even I know you brought up Nirvana earlier, and while I'm really not a big Nirvana fan, I will say, I'll listen to something like In Utero, and it's like that's a fairly abrasive album, just because it is he has a very strong pop sensibility. That doesn't take away the artistic integrity in my eyes. No, I feel like there's even though what we do is very far from that traditional songwriting direction, for us a lot of that stuff's very inspiring because it's fearless in a different way. I feel like to merge a singer-songwriter oriented band with very concise and personal lyrics, and then to merge that with elements that are very experimental, I feel like that takes some balls, because you're kind of going towards two different audiences.
Yeah.
When you go far into the experimental, you're not appealing to mainstream audiences, but you're not really going to piss people off and have people calling you a sellout shill. Whereas, you're really walking a fine line whenever you merge that pop sensibility into it. And that's something on some of our other projects that we're really interested in experimenting with, is making more pop oriented music. Just because it's very fun to write. You can be much less cerebral about it. And it's hard though. For us, we write very subconsciously. We'll come up with a recording session where we'll just chill and kind of improvise, and then we'll cut it up and work from that. And then it's very non-linear. But whenever we will write like a more song-oriented thing, you really have to structure it out, verse chorus stuff, and that's harder for us than doing something a little bit more abstract. That just comes naturally for us.
Yeah, to make a very definitive formula and fit ideas into that can be incredibly difficult when you're used to sort of exploring more. That's why, like, when Tom Waits did Swordfish Trombone.
Oh yeah, I love Tom Waits.
Yeah. That was an experimental record. I mean, he made his own instruments for that record. And for someone of his ilk, which he, cut his teeth on being a singer-songwriter, verse, chorus, verse. I mean, he wrote songs for that, like Rod Stewart covered. But then he turns around and makes something like that, he'd been listening to a lot of, like, the Pixies and Swans and shit like that. And it really opened his eyes to other sorts of music. So he throws that out there, and it lost a lot of people. And he didn't care. It's what he wanted to do at the time.
Exactly. And I find that stuff so interesting. I love seeing an artist out of their element. That's something that is so inspiring and exciting for us. We're big Ween fans, and that's something that also was like, God, the way they can just change sounds song to song so fluently and effortlessly. The lack of constraints on their creative process is just incredibly inspiring. You can tell they had a lot of fun making that music, and that's something that we, or at least Dylan tends to be a lot more he can change sounds a lot easier than me. I tend to bog down into a certain idea, and then I just entrench into it, and that can get constraining because I'll obsess over a very specific set of constraints for a certain album or set of songs. But I feel like for me at least, it's the most fun whenever I'll set a set of constraints and then do something unexpected with that set of constraints. Because you can kind of get trapped in your own self-imposed creative rut.
Yeah.
Trying to subscribe to making an album, at least for me, it's usually trying to make a record cohesive. And then that can be overly constraining because you're trying to make all of the songs have this consistency, which is like good, but it can become very frustrating. And that's a lot of what Dylan helps with.
Yeah, it helps you from not painting yourself into a corner.
For sure. And
so when do you think your next project is going to see the light of day?
It should be done in the fall. So I'd assume it'll probably be releasing near the end of October, would be my guess. We'll have a new music video coming out in the next month or two, and then probably take a little hiatus. I know we should also be dropping another record this year for our second band, and that's going to be very radically different. And that should be releasing sometime over the summer. So,
what's the name of that one?
Beeftoven. That's our. God, there are a few words to describe some of the insanity that we're doing with that record. It's kind of a dark comedy record. Dark stoner comedy.
So something Zappa-esque almost?
Almost, definitely. A lot of Ween and Zappa influence on it, for sure. Along with a lot of our industrial influence, but very weird. Kind of a collage of samples that we're working on with that album.
And then with that, now you have how many different entities under?
Right now we have 2 bands.
Okay.
So with this band, Gown, that's primarily more of our more personal, darker, introspective stuff. And then Beethoven's more of our band where we can just do whatever the fuck we want.
Nice.
So with that, we're going to be dropping a pretty eclectic range of records. We've kind of got the next 2 or 3 years kind of planned out because we have a lot of projects we want to do, but they're all radically different. So I'm excited about starting work on some of that stuff.
Excellent. So I guess in closing, Dylan, we haven't really talked.
Yeah, sorry about that. I've been I just got over being sick this week, and also Noah's a much better speaker. If you couldn't tell, he's very well spoken when it comes to expressing what needs to be said. But I guess I'll give a little backstory to what I guess led me down this avenue and how me and Noah came together to create these projects. It's kind of funny because growing up, I was kind of forced into a very Christian household, and they set you in this very specific mindset. They tell you that as you're growing up, like, you kind of have your freedom of choice. You can get out of this if you don't believe in it. But it's like if you were strapped in a wheelchair and pushed down a hallway, and they say you have 2 paths, but one goes up a set of stairs, and they're forcing you down the second hall, and you kind of just. I won't go into too much detail, but like, it's just for one, Christians are, it's like almost cult-like with how upfront they are with their brainwashing. I mean, you're called a sheep. I mean, it's just like, you're not supposed to think for yourself. You are supposed to think this one way. And when you grow up in that environment, you don't have very many ways, many avenues to get out and express yourself. And, music was that one thing that I had that, I could delve into these darker aspects of, I guess, my psyche or subconscious. But I mean, you just realize growing up in those scenarios that it's everyone's wearing masks in those situations. And I mean, there was very dark things that happen behind curtains and situations like that because there's such massive groups of people who want to keep this image of being these perfect humans, you never see in the light of day. And it's just, I feel like that having that experience really kind of formed the types of sounds I make and can help, I guess, add to this project. Noah definitely helped bring that out of me when I met him, so I can thank him for that. But yeah, that's kind of my little scenario, I guess.
Well, it gives some context at least, because there's both of you. There's 2 sides to that coin. It's nice to know that that there's a depth there on both fronts. It's not just one set of eyes and ears that are like molding this. It's a concerted, combined effort.
It's a therapeutic thing
for sure.
Really. I think it's helped us both process a lot of trauma and just coping with the world in a less unhealthy way.
Yeah.
Maybe not healthy, but less unhealthy.
I don't know. The creation of art is probably the healthiest way to deal with trauma in a public venue anyway.
For sure.
So I'm really glad you guys came on. I really, really enjoy Ape of God. And
Thank you. I
appreciate
really loved
that.
it. Thank you. Thank
I
you so
can't
much.
I can't wait to hear the next project.
Great. Love to talk to you again sometime. Thanks
Absolutely.
for having us on.
Next time you have something coming out, hit me up. We'll get it started.
Great.
For sure.
Thank you.
All right, guys. You have a great night.
You too.
You too.
Night. All right, everyone. That was Gown. The sounds you've been hearing below our voices this evening are dark, menacing, and cinematic, as I said before. And as evidenced by what you're hearing, that all of those adjectives are completely accurate. I really, really enjoyed connecting with these younger people that are really, really just diving deep into sounds that I really didn't imagine this younger generation would be in thrall of, but they certainly are. And as you've heard, they both carry some very eclectic tastes. Ones that I completely see eye to eye with. It's as if history sort of repeats itself with youth culture, and I'm glad to see it. I really hope everyone enjoyed this episode. I really, really want to impress upon you that this record, Ape of God, is extraordinary. And gosh, if I could just give it away for them, I would. But sadly, I cannot. But what you all can do is go to Bandcamp, go to any music streaming service, and their record is available. So from all of us here at 3:33 a.m. Studios, I've been Peter. They've been Gown. You've been beautiful. Take care of each other, everyone. Some scary times right now. And if I could put just a little bit of positivity and love into your lives, I'm more than happy to do so. As long as you keep listening, I will keep yammering with these musicians, artists, authors, and I'll keep giving it to you. Good night, everyone.